Hi everyone. It's been something of a long wait. It's totally worth it. You've seen some bits of animated bits in the middle. That was I was getting very excited because a speaker had entered the room, and I'm very honored to introduce our next speaker. Um, we um, we at NowFest are all huge fans of his writing, of his mind. He's a psychoanalyst and a novelist with over 26 books up his sleeves. His depth of knowledge in cultural psychology and psychology of religion is unfathomable. And he's going to talk to us today about the move towards a more culturally sensitive psychology. We're talking about Dr. Sudhir Kakar. His work has been profiled in just absolute dream publications, the New York Times, Le Monde, and Die Zeit, which portrayed him as one of the 21 most important thinkers of the century. We're absolutely delighted to have him on the Now Fest. So, um, um, thank you so much. I'm almost like I'm tongue tied. I'm just so happy you're here. Over to you, sir.
Okay. Thank you, Reshma, and thank you everyone at Now for inviting me. I'm really happy to be here, and I hope we can do something together today. I think you have already said in your program that, which I'll only recapitulate here, that most of our psychological knowledge, or in social sciences generally, on how human beings feel, think, act, is derived from a small subset of the human population, which the Harvard psychologist Joseph Heinrich and his colleagues, in a thought-provoking article in 2010 called WEIRD, the acronym standing for Western, Educated, Industrialized, Rich, and Democratic. An article which has just been updated into a book, The Weirdest People in the World. This knowledge, they demonstrate, is built on experimental subjects almost exclusively composed of undergraduates or the children of academics and other who live near Western universities. This small group of statistical outliers share such traits such as being individualistic, valuing analytic thinking, belief in free will and personal responsibility, and so on, are both the producers and subjects of our contemporary psychological knowledge, which has then been blithely generalized to the rest of humankind. The social psychologist Jonathan Haidt demonstrates the huge chasm between the weird and other in his study of morality, where he interviewed 12 groups of different social classes in different countries. He tells each interviewee different stories and then asks if there is something wrong in how someone acts in the story, and if so, why is it wrong? One of the story goes, a man goes to the supermarket once a week and buys a chicken. But before cooking the chicken, he has sexual intercourse with it. Then he cooks it and eats it. One of his groups was from the students of the University of Pennsylvania, a liberal Ivy League college in the United States, and certainly the most weird among the selected groups. This was the only group out of the 12 where a majority, 73%, tolerated the chicken story, finding it okay. It's his chicken, it's dead, nobody's getting hurt, and it is being done in private. Or from my own discipline, psychoanalysis, my colleague Anurag Mishra uses the analogy of wine. The terroir of a wine is a specific place with its particular soil and climate where the wine is made, and thus different terroirs, although made with the same sort of grape, have different wines. The terroir of human beings, historical, geographic, cultural, social, political, religious, too, varies and will produce different psychoanalytic wines. The terroir of psychoanalysis for more than a century has been and continues to be Western. It contains many Western cultural ideas that permeate the psychotherapy theories and practice. Shared by analyst and patient alike, pervading the analytic space in which the two are functioning, fundamental ideas about human relationships, family, marriage, male and female, and so on, which are essentially cultural in origin, often remain unexamined and are regarded as universally valid. As has been said, if a fish was a scientist, the last discovery it would make would be of water. The English poet T.S. Eliot expresses the preeminence of the cultural succinctly. Because I know that time is always time, and place is always and only place, and what is actual only for one time and only for one place. We must remember that culture as a fundamental way of viewing ourselves and the world we live in is not a later substrate in the formation of the psyche, but is present from the beginning of life. On a deep, unconscious level, culture and psyche co create each other. Their relationship is like yin and yang, each shaping the other. We know that this kind of relationship is even true neurobiologically. Take the example of Miller-Lire illusion, where lines of equal length give impressions of different length, an illusion created by the orientation of the arrow caps placed at their ends. I'm sorry I can't show it to you, but I think most of you have seen it. Two lines with arrows at the end, one arrow facing inside, one line the arrows are facing inside and one they are facing outside. And if you look at it, the, the arrow with the ones which facing outside, the line looks longer. Now this illusion is consequence of a depth perspective shaped by the rectangular cues of buildings we live in. Children who grow up on round huts rarely experience the Muller-Lire arrows as an illusion. In other words, our cultural environment in its everyday structures, practices, and aesthetics shapes the way our brains process visual information. And if this is true for neurobiological non-conscious visual processing, it seems almost certain it will be true for psychologically relevant conscious and unconscious processes. Let me just give a couple of examples that are fundamental for our psychic makeup and the way we view the world: gender and family. Unconsciously absorbed since childhood, it is our culture that determines what it means to be, look, think, or behave like a man or a woman. This becomes clearer if one thinks of Greek or Roman sculpture with their hard, muscled men's bodies and chests without any fat at all, familiar to most Europeans from childhood visits to museum, or reproduced in countless visual mediums, and compare it with the sculpted representations of Hindu gods in the temple or the Buddha, where the bodies are softer, suppler, and in their hint of breasts nearer to the female form. Between a minimum of sexual differentiation needed to function heterosexually with a modicum of pleasure, and a maximum which cuts off any sense of empathy and emotional contact with the other sex, which is experienced as a different species altogether, there's a whole range of positions, each occupied by a culture that assumes it is universal and insists on calling it the only one that is mature and healthy. And the family, from my own training analysis in Germany long, long ago, I remember my feelings of estrangement on on how my analyst and I attached varying importance to different family relationships. For instance, in my Indian childhood, I'd spent long periods of my young life in the extended families of my parents. Various uncles, aunts, and cousins had constituted a vital part of my growing up experience. To pay them desultory attention or reduce them to parental figures in the analytic interpretations by my analyst felt like a serious impoverishment of my inner world. This almost exclusive emphasis on the parental couple in psychoanalysis, I realized, has also to do with the modern Western conception of the family, which has the husband wife couple as its fulcrum. In the traditional Indian view, which still exerts a powerful influence on how even most modern Indians view marriage and family, the husband wife is a very important bond, but parents, sons, and filial bonds among the sons living in an extended family are as important to the idea of the family. The couple is important, but for many, it is but secondary to the idea of the family. Cultural ideas demand that the universal dream of sexual love that constitutes and seeks to find its culmination in the couple be muted. They enjoin members of the extended family to remain vigilant, lest the couple becomes a fortress that shuts out all other relationship within the family. Such cultural ideas and the values associated with them are a part of what I would call a cultural unconscious that is a vital constituent of the psyche. Entering through the cultural unconscious, a culture's fundamental propositions about human nature, human experience, the fulfilled human life, its dominant values irradiate all aspects of the culture and psyche of its members, but of course to different extents. As an example, let me take my own country to reflect on and share with you on what more than 50 years of clinical and research experience has taught me. Let me only take one of its dominant values, which is not only fundamental in delineating an Indian psychology and psychology of Indians, but also in developing this cultural psychology in a modern scientific sense as complementary to the dominant Western models, and thus contribute to the growth of a more comprehensive and inclusive discipline of psychology than what is currently taught in universities and colleges in our country. I would suggest that the dominant value of Indian civilization, its primary target of attention, is connectedness. And I will begin here with the body. The Indian emphasis on connectedness is reflected in the Indian image of the body, a core element in the development of the mind. For Ayurveda, one of the chief architects of the cultural image of the human body, the body is intimately connected with nature and the cosmos. And there is nothing in nature without relevance for medicine. Wind, rain, sun, and moon, the type of land, time of the day, and seasons all have an effect on the body's health and disease and are elaborated in detail in the Charaka Samhita and the Sushruta Samhita, the two foundational texts of Ayurveda. For instance, breezes from the east cause obstruction of tissue pores and thus skin disease. A heavy breeze can cause stiffness and giddiness, but relieves excessive hunger. Arid regions comprising of few trees, strong winds, intense sun, and little water have the least number of diseases. Ayurveda then spells out detailed regimens for preserving health in the body's many interactions with nature. For the rainy season, for example, as the one which you are having now, it asserts in the body weakened during the period of dehydration, which is summer, the power of digestion is also weakened. It is further weakened due to the vitiation of vata and other doshas during the rain. The power of digestion in the period is also affected due to gas coming out of the earth, rainfall, increase of acidity in water, and consequently vata and other dosas get vitiated. So it is advisable to be moderate as regards to diet and regimen during rainy season. It then goes on to recommend the use of honey in food and drinks, the eating of old barley, wheat and rice, along with the meat of wild animals, so that's for non-vegetarians, wine sweetened with honey, abstaining from sleep during the day, going out in the sun, it's excessive exercise, etc. The Indian body image then stresses an unremitting interchange taking place with the environment, simultaneously accompanied by a ceaseless change within the body. Moreover, in the Indian view, there's no essential difference between body and mind. The body is merely the gross form of matter, sthul sharira, just as the mind is more subtle form of the same matter, suksham sharira. Both are different forms of the same body, mind, matter, sharira. In contrast, the Western image is of a clearly etched body, sharply differentiated from the rest of the objects in the universe. This vision of the body as a safe stronghold with a limited number of drawbridges that maintain a tenuous contact with the outside world has its own consequences. It seems that in Western discourse, both scientific and artistic, there's considerable preoccupation with what is going on within the fortress of the individual body. Preeminently, one seeks to explain behavior through psychologies that derive from biology to the relative exclusion of the environment. The contemporary search for a genetic basis to all psychological phenomena, with undoubted valuable gains in our understanding, is thus a logical consequence of the Western body image. The natural aspects of the environment, the quality of air, quantity of sunlight, presence of birds and animals, the plants and trees, are a priori viewed, when they are considered at all, as irrelevant to intellectual and emotional development. Here then is a new field of inquiry, an area of psychology that naturally evolves from the Indian emphasis on connectedness, namely a systematic study of the effect of environment on human development, cognition, and mental health. Connectedness also points to another direction in unraveling the mystery of consciousness, the holy grail of both contemporary biology and psychology. In the current high status enjoyed by neurosciences, consciousness is believed to be an epiphenomena of the brain, arising from processes that are taking place in an encapsulated brain. In the Indian view, the brain will not be seen as an encapsulated entity that is the originator of consciousness. Instead, it will be seen as connected to and functioning as a filter through which an all-pervasiveness consciousness passes to become a personal consciousness. The universal consciousness takes on the qualities of the individual filter to become a personal consciousness, although it is possible for spiritual adepts, artists, and even others to occasionally bypass the filter and connect with the universal consciousness. From the body, let me come to the ways the emphasis on connectedness leads to the conception of the person and nature of human relationships that differ from the dominant Western view. In contrast to the modern West, the Indian view of the self is not that of a bounded, unique individuality. The Indian person is not a self-contained center of awareness interacting with other similar such individuals as in Greek and post-Enlightenment European civilization. Instead, in the dominant image of the culture, the self is constituted of relationships. An Indian is not a monad, but derives his or her personal nature interpersonally. All affects, needs, and motives are relational, and distresses are disorders of relationships, not only with the human, but also with the natural and cosmic orders. Corresponding to the cultural image of the body, the Indian person too thus tends to experience herself as more of a changing being whose personal psychological nature is not constituted of a stable but a more fluid sense of identity that is constantly formed and reformed by the interactions with the environment. The Indian person's boundaries between soma and natura, between self and others, between body and mind, also tend to be less clearly demarcated. The greater connective orientation is also congruent with the main thematic content of Indian or traditional Indian art. In traditional Indian painting, and especially in temple sculptures, for instance, man is not represented, or man is represented not as a discrete presence, but as intimately linked to the surroundings, existing in all his myriad connections. These sculptures, as Richard Lenoy has observed, are an, and I quote, all encompassing labyrinth flux of animal, human, and divine, visions of life in the flesh all jumbled together, suffering and enjoying in a thousand shapes, teeming, devouring, turning into one another. Quote end. A human being, even God Krishna, although the center of an Indian miniature painting, is not central to it. Trees, flowering bushes, cows, peacocks, low hills, other human figures are all important parts of the painting and seem to be connected to the central figure. Let me add that I'm not advancing any simplified dichotomy between Western cultural image of an individual autonomous self and relational transpersonal self of Indian culture. Both visions of human experience are present in all major cultures, though a particular culture may, over a length of time, highlight and emphasize one at the expense of the other. What the advent of enlightenment in the West has pushed to the background for the last couple of hundred years is still the dominant value of the Indian identity, namely that the greatest source of human strength lies in a harmonious integration with the family and the community. This widespread consensus asserts that belonging to a community is a fundamental need of man. Only if man truly belongs to such a community, naturally and unself-consciously, can he enter the river of life and lead a full creative and spontaneous life. As a corollary, it follows that a large part of individual happiness or suffering would be viewed as the individual share of the happiness or suffering of his family or community, his salient group in a particular context. The yearning for relationships, for the confirming presence of loved ones, and the distress aroused by their unavailability in times of need are more hidden in Western societies. Here I'm primarily talking of North European and North American societies. Here the prevailing value system holds that individual independence and initiative are better than mutual dependence and community. But whether a person's behavior on the scale between fusion and isolation is nearer the pole of merger and fusion with others or the pole of complete isolation depends, of course, on the culture's vision of a good society and individual merit. To borrow a metaphor from the philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer, human beings are like hedgehogs on a cold night. They approach each other for warmth, get pricked by the quills of the other, and move away until, feeling cold again, they again come closer. This to and fro movement keeps being repeated until an optimum position is reached, wherein the body temperature is above the freezing point, yet the pain inflicted by the quills, the nearness of the other, is still bearable. The balancing point is different in various cultures. In India, for example, I would suggest, as compared to modern European and North American cultures, the optimum position entails the acceptance of more pain in order to get greater warmth. In contrast to this emphasis on connection, the prevailing Western worldview is dominated by the notion that human satisfaction and goals are personal and individual. Each individual thus accumulates his or her very own unique life experiences, resulting from his or her constitutional equipment, potential, and accidents of fate. Everyone lives in a more or less subjective world, pursuing personal pleasures and private fantasies, constructing a life that will vanish when their time is over. Society's key task is to safeguard the possibilities of this personal fulfillment of life. The state or society are unable to provide anything positive. They cannot add anything essential to individuals' fulfillment. What they are able to do, however, is to prevent something negative, namely the restriction of individual satisfaction. As I've said earlier, I'm not advancing any simplified dichotomy between the Western image of an individual autonomous self and the relational transpersonal self of Indian culture. These prototypical patterns do not exist in their form in any society. My psychotherapeutic experience with patients from European or North American middle classes tells me that the autonomy of the self is often enough as precarious in reality as is the notion of an Indian self that is merged in the surroundings of its family and community. Both visions of human experience also have their downside. If the dark side of individualism is the incorrigible pursuit of self-interest in the grip of unbridled greed, then that of communality is its exclusivity, its intolerance, and thus its potential for violence. If connectedness is an essential value of Indian civilization, then sympathy is the defining attribute of this connectedness, the channel through which the connectedness flows. Some of the greatest Indian icons, Buddha in ancient India, Kabir, Nanak in medieval India, Tagore and Gandhi in modern India come immediately to mind, have held that compassion, caring, sympathy, I'm using these interchangeably, as essential to how we connect or must connect it, not only to human beings, but to all existence. Sympathy, the overarching term which I'm taking here, is the feeling of kinship that extends to beyond what is our kin, a sense of we that extends beyond kinship. And this feeling of kinship is not limited to human beings, but extends to the natural world. Here, Tagore and Gandhi are in complete agreement. Brotherhood, Gandhi writes in one letter, is just now a distant aspiration. To me, it is the test of true spirituality. All our prayers and observances are empty nothings so long as we do not feel a live kinship with all life. For Tagore, in contrast to the West, Indian civilization sought to establish a relation with the world, with nature as also with living beings, not through the cultivation of power, but the fostering of sympathy. It's a quote from Tagore. When we know this world as alien to us, then its mechanical aspect takes prominence in our mind. And then we set up our machines and our methods to deal with it and make as much profit as our knowledge of its mechanism allows us to do so, he writes. This view of things does not play us false. This aspect of truth cannot be ignored. It has to be known and mastered. Europe has done so and reaped a rich harvest. For us, the highest purpose of this world is not merely living in it, knowing it, and making use of it, but realizing our own selves in it through expansion of our sympathy. Not alienating ourselves from it and dominating it, but comprehending and uniting it with ourselves in perfect union. Uh, Let me repeat that Indian and Western are not monolithic categories, but only refer to the dominant strands in the imaginations of two civilizations. Tagore is also not suggesting a simplified dichotomy between India and the West. In the West, too, there have been thinkers, for example, Edmund Burke and Adam Smith in the Anglo-Saxon world, Schopenhauer in the German-speaking one, who declared compassion as the basis of all morality, who have shared the traditional Indian civilizational emphasis on sympathy, love in its most elevated form, as indispensable to social cohesion and solidarity. And we are all familiar with the famous slogan of the French Revolution, now a universal aspiration of liberté, égalité, fraternité, liberty, equality, fraternity. It is interesting to note that fraternity, brotherhood, occupies the last place in this short list and indeed has become muted, if not sidelined, in contemporary discourse. I must also note that with the exception of saints like Saint Francis, who is said to have addressed even a wolf as brother wolf, the dominant current of Western thought since the last 200 years has confined brotherhood sympathy to one's own group and not extended it beyond its borders to other human beings, not to speak of other species. In our fascination with Western intellectual gurus, from Karl Marx to Michel Foucault, we do not realize what a disproportional space the Western idea of the role of power in social relations has come to occupy in modern Indian mind. Again, this is not to reject the value of the role of power and the truth it contains, but to seek to assimilate this truth with our own heritage on the primacy of sympathy. If I had to give myself a label, then it would not be that of a cultural relativist, but of a minimal universalist. Human beings share universals, but they are much less than what we believe. Unlike Gandhi, Tagore welcomed modern science and Western forms of knowledge. He admired the fullness of the intellectual vigor in the West that is working toward the solutions to problems of life. What he bemoans is that the mental vitality of modern forms of knowledge are not balanced by the Indian idea of the cultivation of sympathy. Sympathy, then, as I understand it, is the highest manifestation of the human soul. It is a continuum of loving connectedness to nature, art, visions of philosophy or science, living creatures, and of course to other human beings. What it gives rise to are moments of quiet exaltation that come from the flow of connectedness, from communion, to be sharply differentiated from the gratifying boost given by the feeling of power that comes from understanding the world. Personally, I fully subscribe to Tagore's view that all our poetry, philosophy, science, literature, art, religion, society, and politics serve or must serve to widen the range of our kinship, our sympathy, the principle of the soul. Initiated in a love for those who nurtured us when we were children, and a love for our own children, friends, lovers as we get older. It is only the wider and wider manifestations of sympathy that are the true measures of human progress. The soul is insignificant as long as it is imprisoned within an individual self. It reveals its significance and its joy only in connectedness. The more vigorous our individuality, the less the need to encase the individual self in an armor of self centeredness, and more the capacity to make it permeable and thus participate in the play of what we call the soul. To me, the question of the fate of the soul after death, central in our religions, is not especially interesting. If we do not free the soul from its prison of individual self, guarded by warders of self centeredness while alive, I doubt whether there is hope of its freedom, of its salvation after death. To adapt the poet Robert Frost's observation on love, the earth is the only place for the soul. I don't know where it is likely to get better. Or as the German mystic Meister Eckhart remarks, no one knows what the soul is, but what we do know is the soul is where God works compassion. How would the cultivation of sympathy, a defining idea of Indian civilization, work out in practice? Let me take a few examples. Modern psychology, Western in its orientation, has made great advances in uncovering some of the mysteries of human mind, the complexity of the human side. The truth it has arrived at, valuable as they are however partial truths. They largely look at human beings from two angles. The first is that the person is a body, a brain mind entity in psychological terms, and thus seek to understand psyche through psychologies that derive from biology. The brain mind school enjoys considerable vogue in contemporary psychology. The other focus of psychology is interpersonal, That, psyche is understood as product of experiences beginning with the family, with a person's social groups. As I said, I have no quarrel with the proposition that lies at the heart of my modern psychology, that at every moment of her being, a person is a part of her bodily and social orders. What I would like to add, a dimension that I find largely missing from West inspired psychology, is that a person is not only a part of her bodily and social orders, but also of her cosmic order. What I'm saying is that if we want to progress further in understanding human mind and bodies, then besides the soma, the body, and the polis, the social order, we need to take into account and focus on another partial truth, the cosmos. Cosmos, as I visualize it, has two aspects, one subtle and the other, well, earthy. The subtle aspect of the cosmos is the spiritual order, which has been variously conceptualized by different cultures at various times of history as animated by gods, ancestral spirits, demonic beings, or in most sophisticated formulations as God, universal spirit, or simply the sacred. The earthy aspect of cosmos is the environment in which we are born and live our lives. How would sympathy affect the goal of modern psychotherapy, specifically my own discipline of psychoanalysis? The goal of psychoanalysis is to lead to an outcome where the person, through an increased self understanding by making the unconscious conscious, attains a freedom to love, work, and play, free from inhibitions her mind has gathered over the life cycle, especially from the childhood years. In other words, it is liberty from inner inhibitions that is the highest goal of psychoanalytic therapy. Is this sufficient as goal? From the viewpoint of sympathy, fraternity, we would need to view psychoanalysis as a transforming quest for self knowledge that not only frees us from internal inhibitions, but extends the range of our compassion and empathy. A successful analysis would then be one that leads to self understanding and growth of wisdom, then it enriches our life with meaning and motivates us to act beyond our narrow interests. It will not be content with the reaching of the Freudian ideal of the autonomous individual, but view it as a stepping stone to the caring individual. Let me take one hypothetical example. The treatment of a person suffering from anhedonia, the condition where one finds no pleasure in any activity, however intrinsically pleasurable the activity may be. In this other conception which I'm advancing, the therapeutic goal will not only be a restoration of sexual pleasure, but a restoration that takes place under the guiding star of loving intimacy with the partner, the form of sympathy in this context. In such an analysis, the pleasure of eating will not be restored only for itself, but under the star of fellowship, the form of sympathy in this context, which turns even a simple meal into a feast, a celebration of solidarity with others who share it. Narcissism, whose pathological forms are the chief obstacles to the cultivation of sympathy, would assume a central place in both clinical and theoretical explorations. To take another example, this one from my other interest, literature. Have we sufficiently explored the basic assumptions that lie behind Western theories of literary criticism and judgments of literary worth, which we use in the teaching of literature in our Indian colleges and universities? Do they need to be balanced or at least looked at from the angle of sympathy, which I have postulated as a defining feature of the idea of India? A hint of the possibilities is again provided by Tagore in his remarks on Shakespeare, who he greatly admired, and Kalidas, who he revered. I quote, "The fury of passion in two of Shakespeare's youthful poems is exhibited in conspicuous isolation. It is snatched away, naked, from the context of the all. It is not the green earth or the blue sky around it. It is there ready to bring to our view the raging fever which is in man's desires, and not the balm of health and repose which encircles it in the universe." As I understand him, Indian literary criticism will pay as much attention to the movement of sympathy in a work of literature as following Western canons it does to the movement of passions. The highest accolade will, of course, be reserved for literary works that combine both the movements. Some of Tolstoy's writings come immediately to my mind. In conclusion, I will only say that in face of a West-centering globalization, the world cannot afford to lose a lens through which Indian cultural imagination, as also the imaginations of other civilizations, have viewed the fundamental questions of human existence. For these are invaluable resources for the advancement, not only of human knowledge, but of sympathy. Thank you.
I was saying that was an absolutely fantastic. It was a beautiful talk from covering from literature to painting to understanding the human mind and taking us through that entire journey. Was absolutely beautiful. I don't know how much time you have. I have one or two questions that I would love to ask you. The one thing that I did want to ask you was that this is an era where this is a we talk about culture is the group, and then there is a way of looking at the group, and then there's a way of looking at just the individual. And as you pointed out, the Indian is not the Eastern mind per se is not one individual. It's a combination of environment, it's a combination of the family, the gender, it's everything together. It's one entire package, it's one entire environment, it's not one human. um, in the era where cultures are mixing today, right? Um, is there a new emerging culture where the West and the East have seemed to mingle in a way, maybe in smaller brackets, but in brackets nonetheless? Is there an emerging culture that you see here?
Uh, I hope so. At the moment, though, it seems, although again, it may start changing very soon, that the weight of the Western culture and its idea of what human beings are, what human existence, nature is very strong. It is taking, washing, it is flooding a lot of our streams and rivers, yes. But there has always been also in the West an openness to the other civilization, and it is of course depends on the generations like yours and others to come to also contribute to that universal one, so that the river is not only from one source, that other streams also go into it, and that it does become a hope or a wish, a universal psychology, much more. So that's why I call it towards a universal psychology. There isn't one. There isn't one still. No.
Thank you. Yeah, that makes sense. Also, the fact that the East is taking a lot of the West, and the West is also taking a lot of the East, and maybe the balances, maybe the scales might not be in the same. We might they not be in the same proportions, but it is nonetheless a new culture. It is a there is a way of looking at it from a collective consciousness, and also having a very strong sense of individualism, which seems to be emerging. There was another thing that also wanted us, which is something we're seeing the world over, not just in the East. The fact that, like you said, kinship is coming from also a sense of the entire environment. There is a kinship with the environment, and this is something that we have lived with for centuries as one country, and in the East as well. It's similar in China. Nisbet talks about it very beautifully in the Geography of Thought as well. He talks about how um, the East has a way of it's an entire cycle, it's an entire ecosystem that is one individual, and everything that happens within that ecosystem or for that ecosystem. Um, the rising tide of there is a sense of belonging, and there is a sense of nationalism that is rising the world over. And is this separate from culture? Is it a separate thing that is evolving from the mind of this new emerging human?
No, I would say uh, this is the extension of the community, which extension of the family, which was so absolutely geared to protect and be part of. And when you keep extend the family first, then to the community, then to the and then you extend it to the nation, that it becomes. Then the only difficulty with it is that love is extremely good, but if the love is only limited to the nation, then all the others outside, then so the thing is you're then extremely very ready also for violence. The, you are so human beings are both extremely loving and extremely violent. Extremely loving as long as it is their community, etc., and extremely violent for anything outside it.
The prickles on the hedgehog.
Sorry.
The needles on the hedgehog on the book.
Right. Okay. I think your time is also.
I think so.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much for coming here. We are absolutely delighted. Thank you so much for having you. I'm sure that our audience has also had a fantastic time.
Thank you. All right.
Thank you so much.